Hi, it's Dave Kites again. This time in this video, I'm going to show you how to use the new Wixey gauge on our new router table. The Wixey gauge is a digital readout. It tells you the height of the top of the bit relative to a zero that you set. We call that zero the absolute zero. There's also an incremental zero, which I'll describe later. But the absolute zero is the most important one. What we want to do is set absolute zero on the gauge to be when the top of the bit is exactly flush with the top of the table. And then when we move the router, the gauge will tell us how much above or below the tabletop we are. Of course, we don't care much about below, but how much above. So you probably have gotten the bit in, you've gotten your ring back in and locked, and the bit's probably down a little bit below the top of the table. If it's not, put it down there to start. I like to use a gauge block. You can also use a straight edge. I'll show you both. And what I like to do is hold the gauge block over the top of the bit and slowly use the lift to slowly raise the bit till it contacts the gauge block, and there it just hit. A little too high, so I'll go back down a little bit. I'm moving the wheel on the lift about half an inch, quarter of an inch at a time. There, it just cleared, so I'll go back a half. You can move the wheel little bits and it moves the bit even smaller bits, so it's very precise. And I want it till I just am dragging. You can hear that, just dragging. Now, to do it with the straight edge, you put it on there and you wiggle, and it should just catch the edge of that straight edge, the edge of the bit. If it doesn't, you can raise it up a hair. There, now it's definitely hanging up. So I'll go back down a hair, okay? It's up to you how precise you want to be. I like to get it pretty close. That's where I want to set my absolute zero on the Wixey gauge. So we go to the gauge. It has 3 buttons. The first top button is a millimeter inches button. You get to pick the units for the display, millimeters or inches. The middle button is ABS INC, absolute and incremental. Again, we're setting the absolute zero. I'll talk to you about the incremental zero just a little bit later. And then there's the on, off, and hold to calibrate button. 1 button, 2 functions. Right now the gauge is off, so we're going to turn it on by touching the on, off button. It comes up and it says ABS, IN, and a number. Absolute scale, inches, units, and a number. That's the number of inches that it used to be above the tabletop from the guy that used it the last time, not this time. So that number is meaningless, wrong. You have to re-zero the Wixey gauge every time you change the bit, because you don't get the bit in the collet the same height every time. So that's why you have to zero it every time. So that's left over from the last guy that zeroed it. It saves that absolute zero in memory, even if it's powered down. So if you were at home using this and you set it once to absolute zero and you're going to use that bit for the next 2 or 3 days making a lot of parts, that would be really handy. Here in the shop, you're going to have to, every time you put a bit in, you're going to have to recalibrate if you want to use the Wixey gauge. And I would say it's well worth doing. So that number doesn't matter. We know this is where we want it to be absolute zero. So I go back to the gauge and I check again. I'm in the absolute scale and in inches, which doesn't matter. You can change that on the fly anytime. So I'm holding in the on, off, hold to calibrate button, and ABS is flashing. ABS started flashing after I held that in for just a little bit. So it's flashing, and the number, you see, changed to 0. So it is ready now to set absolute zero right where the bit is at this moment. And to do that, I simply touch the on-off button one more time. Don't hold it in, just touch it. ABS, stop flashing, the number stayed at 0. We have set absolute 0 on the Wixey gauge. So now, when I move the router lift, we get the reading. I just happen to have stopped right at a 1/2 inch, 0.500. And it also tells you in fractions, if you get within a few thousandths one way or the other of a fraction of an inch, a 16th, a 32nd, I don't think it does 64ths. I think it does 32nds and 16ths. And of course, 1/8 and 1/2 and so on, 3/4. It puts that decimal up there too if you're close. It gives you a little leeway either side. But the decimal is always very accurate, close to a thousandths or 2. So right now, the bit is exactly a 1/2 inch above the tabletop. Now, to show you how to use this gauge to advantage, let's take a hypothetical situation and say that I want to make some blind dados in some pieces of wood, or maybe just dados, don't have to be blind. Any kind of dado in the bottom of a piece of wood, because that's how you do it on a router. And let's say I want to make it 3/8 of an inch wide dado, and I want the outside edge of the dado groove to be a 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the board. And I want the dado to be a 1/2 inch thick. 3/8 wide, 3/8 outside edge of the dado is 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the board, and the dado is a 1/2 inch thick. Okay. To get the 3/8 inch wide dado, obviously I put in a 3/8 inch wide cutter, because you can cut 3/8 all at once. Especially when you got a Wixey gauge, you'll see what I mean in a minute. So then I want it 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the board. So I turn the cutter carefully, not trying to cut myself, and I get the cutting edge pointing pretty much straight at the fence. And I like to use the gauge block. I put my gauge block in there, 3/8 of an inch, which is the distance I want the cut to be from the edge of the board, and then I just bring the fence up, get it fairly horizontal, doesn't have to be exact. Bring that up, a little too tight. There, now it's just snug enough. It's actually holding the gauge block up, but it slides easy. That's really close. I would snug up my fence right there. Remember, not too tight on the fence knobs, guys. That's tight enough. That's got it. I'll take my gauge block out. So I got 3/8 wide. I got 3/8 between the edge of the board and the outside cut of the dado. And I want it a 1/2 inch high, and it happens to be stopped right now at very close to a 1/2 inch. So I could just cut, but I wouldn't do that. That's too big a bite, I think, especially in hardwood. When you take too big a bite with a router, you get heat, which will end up burning the wood probably, especially if the bit is not real sharp. And even if the bit is sharp, if you take too big a bite, it gets hot and it will burn the bit, and then it will be dull. It'll dull it quicker, even a carbide. So you don't want to burn these up. The sawdust also can't get out of the way, and you have to push hard on the piece of wood or go very slow, which means it's going to burn again. But if you try to go quick enough so it doesn't burn, then you got to push pretty hard, and you could end up getting chatter and maybe not having an easy time holding it against the fence. Depends on the size of the piece and whatnot. So it's just unnecessarily more arduous, difficult to take a big bite. And you don't have to. That's the beauty of the Wixey gauge. The 3/8 wide and the 3/8 from the edge of the board are set. But the height, I can start anywhere I want. So I lower it down, and I'm going to take 3 or 4 steps to finish my full 1/2 inch depth cut. And I can do that easily because I just got to look at the gauge and it tells me how far up into the wood I am. 103, not quite 1/8 of an inch. Make a pass. Do all your pieces so they all get the same pass, but do that. simply raise it a little more, 207. Raise it a little more for another pass, more passes. Raise it one more time, more passes. And each of these passes is going to be real easy because you're going to be taking out such a small amount of wood. And it doesn't take that much more time. You get a nice smooth cut, the sawdust gets out of the way, it doesn't get hot, it doesn't chatter. It's the way to do it. So now I'm close, I'm at 440 and I want 500. So I could crank this up to 500. There's 501, there's 499. See, you can move it just a hair. And there you get 501, that's close enough. And now I could make my final cut. But there's another tip I want to give you. When you're making the dado, it's for some piece of wood to go into the dado usually, or glass or something going in that dado. Otherwise you wouldn't bother to make it. So if it happens to be the sides of a shelf unit, and a shelf is going into those two dados, one on each side, I always add a little bit more to the nominal depth that the design calls for. So that if I don't cut the shelf exactly short enough, then it'll still fit without beating it into place or taking it back to the saw and cutting it again. So I usually add like 25 thousandths to a 1/2 inch dado. I'll add 20 thousandths to a 3/8 dado. I'll add 10 or 15 to a 1/4 inch dado. And that way I can always am quite sure my shelf, if I cut it pretty close, even if it's a little long, it's still going in. And that much difference will not affect the strength of the glue joint. So you can do that. And that's what I would do. I'd set this at 525 or 6 or so, and then I would make my final cut, and then I'd be done. So that's how the absolute zero can be used to quickly, easily let you make multiple steps, which makes the whole process much gentler and cleaner and easier. So now we'll talk about the incremental dado. Incremental zero, not dado, incremental zero. Wherever the bit is, let's say that I had run a dado or made a cut right here, and it turned out, boy, that is exactly where I wanted that to come out. And now I want to make another cut, and maybe it overlaps the first cut, but I want to make it a little deeper into the wood. Matter of fact, I want to make it exactly 50 thousandths deeper into the wood, or 1/16 of an inch into the wood, more than the cut that I just finished. If that's where I just finished, I can save the mental math by pressing the absolute incremental button, and now it comes up and it says INC inches 0. So the incremental 0 is right there, right where the last cut was finished. So now, if I want to add a 1/16 of an inch and move, I would move my fence a little bit so that I get it in the right position. Maybe it overlaps the first cut, or it's right next to it. I don't know, but you're going to make a step in there, okay? So I would move the fence for that, and then I would put my 1/16 of an inch on the gauge. It's less than that, ain't much. 6'8", 6'6", 6'5". See, at 6'5", it already says it's a 16th. 6'4", it's still a 16th. 6'3" is a 16th, and that's close because 62.5 is a 16th. 62 is still a 61. I was just experimenting. When you get to 0.60, it says that's too far away, and it doesn't call that a 16th anymore. So there is 62 thousandths, 1/16. That is exactly that height higher than the previous cut where I set the incremental 0. Saves the mental math. That's all it does. If I now want to make another step from this position, okay, I can hit the incremental, the absolute increment guy again. And at first time I hit it, it goes back to absolute. And sure enough, it says, well, I didn't check where I started the incremental, but that would add up to wherever I set the incremental 0 above the table, that much plus the 16th that I added, that's going to come out the same as that because it's on the absolute scale. But if I want to make this now a new incremental, I just hit that middle button again, and now it says, okay, now again, right now, that's 0 incremental. And now I can make my step from there if I want. That's all the incremental's for. You can do it all with mental math or a piece of paper and a pencil, and then just set it on the absolute scale to the new number if you want, or you can use the incremental scale. Some guys will do one, some guys will do the other. And we're back to absolute. Since I haven't changed the bit, if nobody else has changed the bit, since the bit hasn't been changed and that hasn't been re-zeroed, if I had to remake a piece or something, again, it's all set up and I can just crank it up to it. I don't have to measure when I get close to see if I'm getting my half. I don't have to even do, well, you might, until you trust it, you might do test pieces, but you wouldn't have to. So that's how you use the Wixey digital readout to make incremental steps using the absolute scale, or make other steps without doing the mental math using the incremental 0 scale. And that's about all there is to it. When you finish with it, it's battery powered, so turn it off. It will time out itself, but it takes several minutes, so we'll just save a little more battery and ask everybody to remember to press the on-off button when you're done. And when I did that, and I come back and turn it back on again, that absolute 0 is saved in there still. So it still is going to say 0 if I back it down to where it's even with the tabletop. Not quite, I'm too low now. Just started to rub and it says 1,000th. So the absolute 0 is saved until you re-zero it using the hold to calibrate button. That said, I think that's all you really need to know about the Wixey gauge. I hope you enjoy using it. I think it's going to make it a lot easier and gentler operation on the router table.